What do Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, and John F. Kennedy have in common? If you said they were all U.S. presidents and they were all assassinated, you're right. But the commonality does not stop there. The rest of the story may explain why they were assassinated. These three leaders were some of the staunchest opponents of the international central banking cartel that controlled politics and governments in Europe and today in the USA. Central banks, such as the USA's privately owned Federal Reserve Bank, dominated by international shareholders, control the issuance of money and credit. They create money out of nothing, then loan it out to us at interest. They risk nothing, but reap vast profits. By manipulating the availability of credit, they create up and down cycles in the economy, which they use to enrich themselves. They make credit freely available to lull people into a false sense of security, which prompts people to use more credit and take greater risks. Then they tighten credit, sending the economy careening downwards, at which point they buy up assets at pennies on the dollar for their foreign shareholders. President Abraham Lincoln was an ardent opponent of the greedy money-making schemes employed by central banks. It had been tried in the USA in the early to mid-1800s and beat back by strong and courageous leaders, but it was firmly in control in Europe. When the Civil War began in America, the international banking cartel agreed to a $150 million government loan package to finance the war. They would resell U.S. bonds in England with the Barings and Rothschilds, putting the United States at the mercy of the British aristocracy and international financiers. Lincoln came up with his own plan. He decided to finance the war with U.S. government notes, which came to be known as greenbacks because the backs were printed with green ink. He decided to pay for the war with money instead of with debt. The traditional way to finance a war in the modern central banking era is to borrow the money from the nation's central bank. The central bank does not have the money, but they create it by the authority of the borrowing government and loan it to the government with interest. It makes the bankers rich, but enslaves the governments and their peoples with vast amounts of debt. Imagine if you had the authority to print your own money, then loan it to the U.S. government at interest. You'd get pretty rich, wouldn't you? It's a nice scam if you can do it, but sorry, you can't. That power was granted in 1913 to a private bank which deceptively named itself Federal Reserve in order to appear to be a government institution. President Lincoln's greenbacks were wildly successful and allowed the government to conduct business without contracting debt. The government-issued debt-free money led to great prosperity in the United States. From the central bankers' point of view, it had to be stopped. The very foundations of their fortune-building system, which had made the heads of state of every nation in Europe except the Tsar of Russia their puppets, were threatened by the greenbacks. Lincoln resisted the central bankers and showed the world that there was a better way, and he died with a bullet in his head. James Garfield became president about a decade and a half after Lincoln's assassination. Garfield, too, was a strong foe of the central banking scheme. He saw American history as a struggle between freedom and slavery, freedom to pursue one's own destiny, or slavery in bondage to the banks that bled the economies of nations and shackled its peoples with insurmountable public debts. In 1881, Garfield said, "Whoever controls the volume of money in our country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. And when you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled one way or another by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate." 2 weeks later, he was dead. Garfield's presidency lasted only 100 days and ended with a bullet. At stake for the bankers is nothing less than world domination through control of world governments. The only motive is profit, and removing a man who is an obstacle to profit is simply a business decision. In 1913, the light of freedom went out in the United States. In a lightning-fast move, the so-called Federal Reserve Act was pushed through Congress and became law, signed on Christmas Eve by President Woodrow Wilson, transferring the money-issuing authority of the U.S. Congress to a private corporation which called itself the Federal Reserve, and which was owned by members of the international central banking cartel. Thus began our nation's downward spiral into bondage to the same powers that had ruled Europe for 150 years. An alert reader might rightfully remark that, coincidentally, the federal income tax was created during the same year. It is no coincidence. A borrower, in this case the government, must have verifiable and quantifiable income in order to assume debt to a bank. Without Federal Reserve debt money, there is no need for an income tax. Essentially, our wealth is systematically transferred to the central bankers using the vehicle of the income tax in order to finance our nation's indebtedness to these bankers. Right away, the U.S. was pushed into a massive European war, in which the bankers financed both sides, and the American people were forced to assume an unprecedented national debt by borrowing from the bankers, since the nation could no longer issue its own money. The first shackles were firmly in place. The only winners at the end of World War I were the international bankers, who amassed huge fortunes on the backs of the men, women, and children who died on battlefields and in villages across Europe. War is the most lucrative business activity that the bankers engage in. They finance both sides, giving unlimited credit to the side they decided will win, and giving just enough credit to the losing side so that they will hold out some hope of victory and keep fighting. The winner's terms of obtaining financing typically require them to pay the bank debts of the loser, so the financiers assume no risk at all. The purpose of war in the modern era is not to right a wrong, but to enrich the financiers. It is to this end that wars are started and conducted, and this is why we now live in an era of endless war. Fast on the heels of World War I, the central bankers began contracting the money supply and tightening credit, leading to the stock market crash of 1929 and the ensuing Great Depression. Huge swaths of American industry, farming properties, and other assets were swept into the coffers of the bankers and their international shareholders over the course of this period of intense suffering in the USA. On top of those profits, the government assumed incredible amounts of debt to fund social programs, public works programs, and, quote, economic recovery strategies. Slowly, the American people began to work their way out of this banker-induced devastation, only to be thrust into yet another international war and to be shouldered with another monstrously large chunk of national debt to the international financiers. World War II was financed not with debt-free government notes, but by banker-owned interest-bearing debt. The U.S. government had given away its right to create money in 1913 and was now firmly in the control of the international financial interests. In a rare move of courage, unparalleled in any American president since 1913 through today, a president confronted the central bankers and threatened to undo their profit-generating system. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy issued an executive order which rescinded the Federal Reserve Bank's authority to issue money. Kennedy then ordered the Department of Treasury to begin printing debt-free money. Large amounts of $2 and $5 denominations of authentic United States currency, not Federal Reserve notes, were circulating, and $10 and $20 notes were being printed when, 5 months after Executive Order 1110 was signed, Kennedy was shot in Dallas. The $2 and $5 U.S. notes were immediately recalled, and the $10 and $20 notes were destroyed before they could be circulated. The power quickly and quietly shifted back to the central bank. President Kennedy demonstrated rare courage in standing against the international financiers, and he died with a bullet in his head. American politicians learned their lesson well. Don't stand in the way of the banks. The banks have limitless resources. After all, they issue our money with just a few strokes of a keyboard, and they have no sense of ethics. They are profit-making businesses, and when the control of nations and continents is at stake, they will let no man stand in their way. They own our money. They own our news media. They own our financial institutions. They own our government. They own us. Our leaders, in our name and based on the power we have invested in them, have mortgaged our nation to the international financiers and sold out America to the European money power structure. The central banks are the ones who benefit from titanic spending bills and deficit-ridden national budgets. The central banks are the ones who benefit from centralized control of an economy. The central banks are the ones who benefit from centralized control of national education systems. The central banks are the ones who benefit from the curtailing of free speech. The central banks are the ones who benefit from gun control and the disarming of the public, lest any should resist them. They own us, because our elected leaders signed our names on the dotted line, pledging our assets and future income to the central banks and their international shareholders. The Democrat versus Republican, liberal versus conservative conflict is the greatest red herring to come out of the 20th century. It keeps us involved, thinking we have a cause, thinking we're making a difference, thinking we have something meaningful to support or oppose, and when we become dissatisfied, we boot out the party in power. Yet the ones who are really in power continue without interruption, unseen and unhindered, laughing at our ignorance as they shovel our wealth into their coffers. Finally, that great American nation has been brought to its knees. Finally, we have been remade into the image of Europe, complete with the European-style socialism that guarantees the financiers' continued success by keeping the people under firm, unrelenting control from cradle to grave. That old glory that flies over our government institutions, churches, and homes is now just a memorial to a bygone era when the light of freedom still shone on this continent. Thomas Jefferson said, "The central bank is an institution of the most deadly hostility existing against the principles and form of our Constitution. I am an enemy to all banks discounting bills or notes for anything but coin. If the American people allow private banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all of their property until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered." Ultimately, we have our hope. Even at this late hour, when we see the end-time system of pervasive totalitarian control and indoctrination of nations that will be used by the Antichrist to control every corner of the globe and to deceive the peoples of the world, we have the book, the blood, and the blessed hope, and need not fear nor be deceived. Ultimately, we will be free, and the international financiers will be chained in the deepest, darkest recesses of hell for all eternity. But that does not mean we should do nothing now. We must arm ourselves with information. Knowledge is power. Support those who take a stand. Educate our family, friends, and acquaintances. Inform our elected officials. We can yet be free if a courageous Congress takes back its constitutional power of issuing money. Until then, we and our children are slaves. Take a dollar bill out of your pocket and look at its face. See the words Federal Reserve Note? This is the mark of our master and the indicator of our servitude. So long as our money bears this mark, and so long as a private bank controls the issuance of money and credit, our nation is in bondage and grows weaker and less able to resist with each passing year.